Hi, I feel like it's really important for me to share my story. I am one of, I'm sure, millions of women that have been a Jehovah's Witness and that has left the organization. And I feel it's really urgent for people to hear the types of emotional and psychological abuse that is found within the organization that directly affects a woman and her children. I want to give you a little background first and let you understand where I was when I became a Jehovah's Witness and where it all began. Um, I was as a child, I grew up in a home. We were financially struggling throughout my childhood, and then I also my mother, she suffered from some type of psychological disorder. She had been diagnosed with many different illnesses, but I believe um, I believe she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. The reason why I feel like it's important for you to understand that is so that you can understand the place where I was at when I first um, heard the message of the Jehovah's Witnesses. It was in 2001 after my mother suffered a long battle with mental illness and cancer. Um I was raised a Southern Baptist. My father often preached. We were often had to go to this church, and there would be a Southern Baptist preacher on the edge of his feet, on the edge of the pulpit, talking about how if you do this or if you do that, you're going to go to hell and you're going to spend eternity there. And um, as a kid, it didn't frighten me. I actually thought it was rather funny and just waited for that moment where when he was standing on the tiptoes of that podium that he was going to fall off one of these days because he was pretty far out there. Um, we often, as kids, just kind of laughed about it. We didn't take it to heart. We weren't directly threatened. I didn't have someone coming to me and telling me, if you don't do this, you're going to go to hell. At least, not at that point in my life. Um, so then, when I was 16 years old, I believe I was about 16, my mom had been diagnosed with cancer. She had lung cancer. She was a smoker. She had smoked since she was probably 15, 16 years old. She was a pretty heavy smoker at that point, about 2 packs a day. She got treatment for her cancer. Eventually, we found some herbal supplements, and she was able to. Her cancer went into remission for 6 years. She still continued to smoke. She was still afflicted, as far as her mentality. Sometimes she didn't even know who I was. Um, and but the impression that I had as a child was just always wondering and waiting for that moment where my mother could come back to me. Because when she would leave, she would be physically there, but she would go into this place where she went back into her past from the abuses that she had suffered. It was very painful for me being a child, seeing my mother having suffered through a life. Her parents were alcoholics, and she was gang raped when she was 16. She then developed cancer and was fighting a battle with her cancer, but um, during the times when she was okay mentally, she was um, attending a university in order to be an English professor. She was extremely intelligent. This woman could pick up a huge book of literature and write a 30-page essay on it and have it done all in one weekend and get a 4.0 on her paper. She was also an artist. She was incredibly talented. She was a painter and she would draw. She could also write very well. She's a very wonderful woman, and I hated to see how much she suffered throughout her whole life. It didn't make sense to me. And the fact that she smoked concerned me too, having been indoctrinated that it's a sin, and that it's not okay to sin against God, and just the confusion. There was just so much confusion from what I learned as a child, what I read in the Bible, and that sort of thing. So in 2001, my mother passed away in late June. And soon after my mother passed away, I started talking to this gentleman who um, who I adored from the first time we began talking. If, throughout my life, if I could say I was ever in love with somebody, that he would have been the one that I felt like I truly loved. We had so much fun together. Um, I would drive 4 hours away or to pick him up and bring his children home, and we would spend time together. And it was pretty early on in our relationship when he was staying at my home that I had a nightmare one night, and it woke him up, and then in turn he woke me up. I was having a nightmare that my mother was burning in hell, and to this day I can still imagine her just pleading out to me with her arms stretched out, begging me to help her, help me, help me. And I was terrified. It was at that time where he pulled out his Bible and he told me, he said, you don't have to be afraid of that. There's no such thing as hell. And my ears perked up immediately, and I'd never even considered there not being a hell. And he showed me scriptures in the Bible and explained to me certain things, like if you put something in fire, what happens to it? It disintegrates, right? So how could it be possible that something could burn eternally? And I have to say that hook, line, and sinker, I heard a bit of truth that lured me in pretty deeply. We stayed up the entirety of the night and through the next day, where he showed me different quote unquote Bible truths that fascinated me. I decided at that point that I was going to continue listening and studying. He would bring some material over for me to look at that was from the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. He was a Jehovah's Witness, and different scriptures that he pointed out about how they would go 2 by 2, and the fact that the Jehovah's Witnesses would go door to door, and they weren't teaching hell, and they weren't threatening or teaching destruction if you didn't obey. They were, saying that if you don't choose God, you just simply cease to exist. It tickled my ears, to say the least, and within a few months, it was the events of September 11th, 2001 occurred. I was terrified, as we all were. At that time, I thought, well, these prophecies that I had been reading about, that the end of times is going to come soon, that, that time might be coming now. I need to get right with Jehovah. My life depended on it. The life of my children depended on it. I certainly loved God with all my heart. This Creator gave me this beautiful life with these amazing, beautiful children that were perfect to me. And I was a single mom, and I was working full time. I was at a very good place of employment. I had been promoted several times, and frequently they loved me there. And I then, on September 11th, decided I was going to go to a Kingdom Hall and study with the Jehovah's Witnesses so that I can make sure that my children that so deserve to live, would be able to live in paradise forever. I began. I went into the Kingdom Hall. We were studying the book of Isaiah, and where they talk about turning the swords into plowing shares or something. I don't even know the whole scripture right now. And it was further confirmation for me that I was at the right place, because they were talking about the end of this system of things and how the prophecies in Isaiah were lining up to things that were occurring currently. So I jumped in head first. I mean, I found God's earthly organization, those chosen by God as, representatives his um, for his people, the ones that will lead us into everlasting life on a paradise earth. And they were very evangelical, going door to door. They sacrificed their lives, to bring people to these truths, and in order for them to have an eternal life. They were 100% dedicated. They gave everything they had. They had chosen to, refrain from higher paying jobs so that they could teach and preach the good news. And that's what I felt so urgently needed to be done. There were so many people in this world that were suffering, that were, just like I was, and just like my mother had been. And I desperately felt the need to help people, and to make sure that my children were being brought up in God's organization. I became a prize pupil, according to the ladies that I were studying with. I didn't question much. I would just absorb it all like a sponge. I had heard the quote unquote truth, and I wanted to learn more. I had to know more. I wanted to get baptized right away, but I was struggling with something at the time that I did not mention to them. I had been a smoker from the time that I was 15. So I'd been smoking for about 10 years. I At home I would write little scriptures on post-it notes and stick them all over the house, and I would, convince myself that okay, I can do this, with the help of God, Jesus will help me. I'm one of God's chosen ones. Certainly he would help me to quit smoking. I mean, I've been receptive and heard the truth, so therefore I am one of God's children. And so I prayed incessantly, and I began feeling, an intense amount of anxiety, just knowing how urgent it was that I quit smoking and that I become baptized so that I could live forever and my children, more importantly, could live forever. I would pray every day, but this urge, this addiction, this stronghold that was on me, was debilitating, to say the least. I become more and more discouraged as time would go by, that I wasn't able to quit smoking. I studied with the Jehovah's Witnesses for less than a year. I had finished the books, and I was approved to get baptized. I knew I had this one affliction that I really needed to take care of, but even at that point I felt as if, well, if I can't quit, if I'm not able to do that, then certainly when I become baptized, maybe God was just waiting for me to make that promise, make that commitment that I would be devoting my life towards him, and then maybe he would intervene in my behalf to help me quit. At this point, I was only smoking 2 cigarettes a day, if that. Um, but I, um, the morning came of the baptism, and um, we were going over questions and things like that before the baptism, and certain things felt a little odd and a little peculiar, but I pushed it in the back of my mind. I couldn't doubt. I couldn't dare doubt those things. For instance, I thought I was supposed to be baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but that wasn't the case. And then I thought to myself, well, this is God's earthly organization. Surely, everything is fine, and I'm doing the right thing. And so I went through with the baptism, and I didn't feel any different at all whatsoever after I became baptized. And that anxiety to quit smoking became even more intensified. I wasn't delivered right away like I somehow thought I would be. Instead, here I was a member of Jehovah's Witnesses, and the same night that I became baptized, I smoked half a cigarette. I knew that it was wrong. I knew that it would, if they knew about that I would be disfellowshipped. Fortunately, I was not born in Jehovah's Witnesses, but it still had a huge impact on me. And I certainly did not doubt the fact that this was God's earthly organization. The only way my children were going to live forever, the only way my children were going to survive through Armageddon, that was certainly on the brink. Already we have terrorists attacking our country, and my safety and my children's safety felt endangered. I feel like it's important for me to also mention that before I met the Jehovah's Witnesses, before I began talking to my boyfriend and that sort of thing, I feel like it's important to mention that I was happy. I had a home that was paid for, my car was paid for, my monthly payments were really low. I, was able to afford to take my kids to Chuck E. Cheese every weekend if I wanted to. I was happy. I felt so blessed. Just left a, uh, I had just left a previously an abusive spouse, my older 2 children's father, and I was completely blessed with the home that I lived in. Everything when I left that situation, that abusive situation, I moved into a home that was, you know, offered to me at a very low price, and one in which I could afford. Being a single mom, I was financially responsible for my children from the day that they were born. Their father was pretty much non-existent, and well, he existed and he stole money from us, and that sort of thing. He was definitely not concerned about the welfare of our children, and that's a whole nother story. But I just want to point out that when I met them, I was at a pretty happy place. Other than worrying about where my mother was and after she died, we were pretty happy. My children and I, we would go out to the park all the time. We had fun together when I was off work, and that sort of thing. So then let's go back and mention, after I had become baptized. We'll get back to that point. So, it became, I feel like it's important to touch on this too. When I was at work, I was once, just loved by everyone. And then once I became a Jehovah's Witness and I started to tell them, I don't feel comfortable celebrating in the, holiday gift exchange. Thank you. I appreciate it. But I don't believe that that's, with, as far as my religion, I don't believe that Christmas should be celebrated. I became ridiculed and persecuted at work, to say the least. And my anxiety, of course, grew even further. I felt alone and isolated. My family, I had pushed them away just as far as they pushed me away. I was, being told by my father at that point that I was going to go to hell for being a Jehovah's Witness. And how could I do such a thing, that I was, turning away from Christ that I already knew? And how could I do such a thing that if I didn't change my ways, I was going to be destroyed in hell? And of course, I didn't believe any of that. Oh, my father, he was so brainwashed. So was all the rest of my family. They were so influenced by Satan. They certainly had no idea of the truth, and I wish more than anything to share the truth with them, but every time that I did, it caused a lot of conflict. I lost my father, I lost my brother, my niece and my nephew that I haven't seen in years. I lost my uncle and my aunt, many of them, when I became a Jehovah's Witness. And it was me. And when I'd been studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses before I got baptized, I had that, once or twice a week we would get together and have this Bible study, and we would laugh and cut up and, study, and I had that human connection. But as soon as I became baptized, I felt so alone. It wasn't what I thought that it would be. I even remember asking if we could continue some type of a Bible study, and of course that wasn't necessary because I had already become a Jehovah's Witness and learned everything that it was necessary for me to learn. I would go to the meetings. There were 2 meetings during the week. On a Tuesday, there was a 2-hour meeting, and I may have these days mixed up. It's been a while, and then on Thursdays, that 2-hour meeting was actually 2 meetings in one, held at the Kingdom Hall, where the women would practice, door-to-door techniques, like what we would say at the door under certain circumstances, and then we would go over the kingdom ministry, I think. And forgive me if I've got this mixed up because it's been so long since I've even thought about it. And then on Thursdays, we had a book study. We would often go to people's homes, and or we would meet at the Kingdom Hall. My book study, personally, in the beginning, met at the Kingdom Hall, and we were at first studying Isaiah, and then after that, I can't remember what book it went into after that. And then on Saturdays, I would get my children up and we would go door to door and do the door to door work. I was encouraged in the beginning to switch childcare providers for my children. And as the lady that had been watching my children, she was an evangelical Christian, and I felt uncomfortable having her teach my children when at that point I believed that she was truly under the influence of Satan. The way she would hoot and holler and scream hallelujah and, talking to demons is what I understood at the time, and speaking out in tongues, which at that time I believed, she was allowing Satan to speak through her in this language that I couldn't understand. I didn't previously feel that way, but after studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses, I certainly felt that way. And so I found new childcare for my children. For a short time, they were going to some Jehovah's Witnesses that were, that I had studied with and went out in field service with, just really nice couple. And then eventually I found new childcare. I just love this woman. She's been my best friend, has been in through everything with me in and out. She knew me um, prior to becoming baptized Jehovah's Witness, and up until this day, she's been through everything with me and has always loved me regardless, have shown me the unconditional love and acceptance that has completely transformed my life, just knowing that there are people out there that don't have conditions on love. And she respected the fact that I didn't want my children to participate in birthdays and holiday celebrations, and I was probably more. Well, I was more of a lenient Jehovah's Witness when it come to my children. I wasn't born, and I think when you're born and you become more strict, and this is how it is, and you cannot steer away from this, because if you do, you're gonna suffer the destruction come Armageddon. Whereas me, I just kind of sympathized a little bit and thought, well, here my kids are. They're having a big birthday party. If even if they're not having birthday cake, I would tell her, well, you can give them a little Debbie or something like that in the other room, and let them watch, a movie or something that they like, so they didn't feel so isolated, that sort of thing. Um, and uh, I had reached this point where I felt like maybe the only way that for my children to have an everlasting life would be if someone, another Jehovah's Witness, could, lead them to everlasting life. I become, hopeless in the thought of ever being able to quit smoking. It was something that had a terrible grip on me, and I believed that, maybe it was time for me to find a brother to marry. And, this is God's, clean organization. I felt as if, I couldn't be doing any wrong by marrying a brother. It was in good standing in the congregation. I found a website online. It was called jwmatch.com. And, it was easy to get on there and, start up a profile. All I had to do was enter the daily text for the day, and I got on there, and very soon afterwards I started getting messages from various people, and one of them stood out to me in particular. It was a young man in his early 20s, just like me. He was just a year or so older than I was, and his English was not very well, as he is Mexican, was living in Mexico, had a family in Mexico. Some really awesome, outstanding pictures of his family on his profile. And, he talked to me and told me, that he would really like to get to know me and pursue a relationship. As a Jehovah's Witness, you can't talk to somebody unless you have the intent to marry. So it happened really fast. Within 3 months, even though we did not talk very much, he spoke Spanish. He knew a little bit of English, and I would use Google Translate to try to communicate. We'd talked on the telephone probably a maximum of 3 times. We during this time, we made arrangements to get married. Um, Yes, in hindsight, I realize how stupid and ridiculous that is. And I now understand the ridicule that I got while I was at work, and people found out that I was getting married to somebody that I'd never met before in my life. But at that time, I was marrying one of God's chosen people. I was marrying someone that loved Jehovah just as much as I did, that wanted love in their life and a perfect family life, that we were going to lead others into the quote unquote truth. Then we were going to we were going to live in paradise everlasting. And even if we had little disagreements and so forth, surely with, God's wisdom and direction, we would be able to work through any issues that we might have. And, even if I didn't feel like I was in love with him, it didn't matter because I certainly loved him as a brother because he is also one of God's chosen people. He is part of this organization. He's part of this clean organization, this organization that, you know, kept its organization clean. I eventually went to the elders in the congregation. I explained to them, I was like, okay, well, I understand that it's, not really advisable to meet someone online, but I did meet a brother that lives in Mexico, and I have his information. I have the name and telephone number of the congregation that he goes to, and we have the intent of getting married, and I would, like for you to make sure that he's in good standing. And at first, the elder was like, okay, you're not supposed to meet people online. You never know what you're getting into. And then I was like, but I have, the congregation's information if you'd like to talk to the elders, just to make sure if he's in good standing. And they congratulated me and were all smiles at the end of the conversation. And then within 2 weeks, they were able to speak to the elders of his congregation and confirm that he is definitely in good standing in the organization. And we even got the blessing to be married within the Kingdom Hall. In order to get married into the Kingdom Hall, you both have to be in good standing, and we got that approval. I have never met this man face to face until I think it was 10 days before the wedding at the Kingdom Hall. I met him outside of my work, and then we left from there to my home, and he proposed to me on the doorstep the first day that I met him. We had already had a wedding dress, our wedding rings, arrangements for the flowers to be made. Within that 10 days, we had a pitch-in dinner figured out. We had the reception all planned, and the date at the Kingdom Hall was set. We were going to get married. We even had it planned out to where we were going to broadcast it on Skype so that his family in Mexico could watch. And so here I made the second gravest mistake of my life. The first one, becoming baptized. Number two would be to marry this man. But of course, I didn't see it as such at the time. And this is the hardest part of this story, and it's very difficult for me to talk about. But here we go. The first week or two, everything was new and it was exciting and I was happy, and it was pretty soon after that his authoritarian type of discipline towards my children. Keep in mind, he had no children at all. He was in his early 20s. Being a Jehovah's Witness, the man is the head of the household. You listen to the brother. I mean, it's the direct headship. It goes, I don't even know anymore. I try to block it out of my mind. But you have Jehovah, the organization, the head of the household, and then the woman. So I had to submit to my husband, and that was difficult for me because he was not the same kind. He did not use the same types of discipline that I'd used with my children. At the time, my daughter was we got married in 2003, so my daughter was 3 years old and my son was 5. I think he had just turned 5. And I'd never had to spank my children. Never. Well, okay, I did spank my son one time, but um, I, they, I felt so guilty and horrible and bad about it because my children were very receptive. All I really had to do was just talk to them, and they would listen to me, and I would explain to them why they shouldn't do something, and they respected me and loved me, and listened for the most part. Of course, get irritable, every once in a while, just like any normal kid, but I never had any problems out of them. And then my husband steps in, and you know one of the first things that happened that was just ridiculous, and it was my daughter was 3, my son was 5. Their room was a mess, so my husband at the time sent them to their room to clean their room, and it wasn't just simply sending them uh, to their room. He locked them into their room, even so far as to lock the outside latch on the door, and told them that they couldn't come out until their room was clean. Um, they had, I kept going to the door, and was going to open the door, and he would step in and push me out of the way, and we would get into a little verbal argument. I'm trying to explain to him they're 3 and 5. You can't send them into a room with toys heaping everywhere and expect them to know how to clean it up and put things where they belong. And it escalated from there. I tried to get into the room to let my children out, and he would push me out of the way, and just to try to avoid the whole physical altercation in front of the children, I decided to step away, and then come back later. We've fought for hours as my children were trapped in this room. They were hungry. They had not had lunch. I was trying to get them lunch, but yet I'm told that I need to be obedient, that he's the head of the household. He's the one in charge of disciplining and so forth. And um, that was one of the minor things that had happened. Um, it escalated to the point to where I was afraid to go to work because I didn't want to leave my children home with him. I wasn't sure what was going to happen, but the more that I came home and stayed home, I felt like maybe I was just, with me not being submissive and not having that submissive heart that I was supposed to have, that maybe I was just making things more difficult on my children. Um, one of the things that happened that comes to mind, just to explain how ridiculous his standards were. He would not let my kids play with Play-Doh. We loved to play with Play-Doh. We would sit at the table and play with Play-Doh for hours at a time, making little sculptures and all kinds of stuff. But when he came into the picture, he wouldn't let us play Play-Doh. It was too messy. Even though I would clean up the mess, he just didn't want the kids to play with that. I didn't understand it. I tried to respect it. Um, they weren't allowed to play with hardly anything. My daughter, um, 4 years old, you know, tiptoeing through the house like a little ballerina because she was happy to see me or happy to see him. When we walked in the door, was told that she was not allowed to do that. You cannot do that. He would say, "Don't do that. You don't stand on your tippy toes and dance through the house." And I would look at him and I was like, "Really? Really? Why?" She's just happy and having fun. And no, it wasn't acceptable. Um, it escalated to the point where he would have my children um, on their knees in the floor with their arms stretched out and their feet up off of the floor. And if you imagine, if you try doing that, imagine how much pressure that puts on your knees. My children were sent to do this for various things, like not immediately getting up to put something away like they're supposed to, or not putting their shoes on, or putting their shoes exactly where they went when, and here my children are 3 and 5 years old, 4 and 5 years old. He would I'll save that for another time. There was one time I remember in particular, um, and I know you all are probably just sitting there thinking, how could I let this man do this to my children? Because I often ask the same things. But I want you to understand that, and this is what's most important, is when you become so indoctrinated, you believe that this is God's organization, the God that created you, the God that created all of this world and all of life, and that has the power to create and destroy. Had asked you, a certain thing, of his people, and if they follow these things, then they will live forever on a paradise earth. And I wanted my children to live forever. Who doesn't want that for their children? And I felt as if my children's lives depended on my obedience. That if I would just be more submissive, and if then maybe things would ease up a little bit. Maybe I was the problem because I was the one interfering. Maybe if I didn't interfere, they would listen to him better, and they would know what they can do and what they couldn't do. And maybe me just getting in the middle of it was making things worse, because anytime I stepped in to intervene, it would be intensified. For example, this one time my daughter, she was sitting there at the kitchen table. She was eating her lunch, trying to eat her lunch. It was the same thing that she had been fed for the previous 3 days. My husband insisted on feeding them, and she was sitting there at the table, and she had tears coming out of her eyes. She was being told to eat, come, come. And my daughter's sitting there, and every bite that she would take, she would gag, and eventually she threw up on her plate. And he speaks up again. Come! I stood up from my seat, and I walked towards my daughter, and I picked up her plate, and I hugged her, and I told her she could go. It was at that moment when she stepped away from the table and realized she had her cup in her hand. She turned back to set it back on the table when I watched my husband very angrily take one step forward and slide his foot out and tripped my daughter into the table. He bust her front tooth out. There was blood everywhere. And I felt like it was my fault. If I had just let him do his thing, and here, my little girl, her tooth was busted out. It was soon after, and I have to mention this too. At this point, I was, my anxiety, my depression was so bad. I was already thinking, what am I going to do? I had gotten pregnant within a month after us being married. I was pregnant with my son, and when I was pregnant with my son, all I could think about was, when I'm not pregnant anymore, after this pregnancy is over, I'm gonna kill myself. I'm hurting my children. They're being, punished because of me. They're being abused because of me. And after my son is born, I'm gonna kill myself. That way they can live forever, and I'm not going to cause them a problem anymore. I had been, I had soon after I had gotten baptized and the anxiety had gotten to me, I had gone to the doctor and had been put on an antidepressant to help me curb the anxiety that I was dealing with. My, um, I told the doctor, I was like, I don't want anything that would be addictive, and that I want something that, you know, um, could help me without being a benzodiazepine. Well, so I was put on an antidepressant, and after I got married, and we would argue, and I was so unhappy. It just I didn't want him to even touch me. I couldn't I I couldn't stand the thought of him touching me. I couldn't stand the thought of sleeping next to him. I started sleeping on the couch. But even at the time, I didn't really feel like it was him as much as it was me. But yet, um, I truly struggled with being submissive to this man. He was an asshole, quite frankly. Um, so I, um, so after I got pregnant with my son, I was in and out of the hospital several times. I was so depressed I could hardly get out of bed. All I could think about and fantasize about for the entirety of my pregnancy was how I was going to die, how I was going to kill myself so my children could live an everlasting life, so that they wouldn't have to suffer the life that I had as a child, having a mentally ill mom, because at that point they convinced me that I was mentally ill. Of course, I wasn't going to tell the doctors why I believed and felt and why I had such depression and stuff, because I wasn't going to bring any reproach to Jehovah's name. It wasn't definitely in my mind. It had nothing to do with Jehovah. It had nothing to do with my beliefs. It was just me. I had a history of mental illness. My mother was mentally ill. That family history is. So I was 3 months pregnant with my son, and their father, when his father disappeared in the middle of the night, left a note on the refrigerator. It said, "I'm sorry, I just can't do it anymore." The third stupidest thing I ever did in my life was when I tracked him down and told him, "What are you doing? You're going to give up eternity? You're going to give up paradise because you can't handle it anymore, because you can't live with me? We're supposed to work things out. We're married. We don't just give up. You have no grounds to leave. That, you know, what about your whole family? You would lose your whole family. You would become disfellowshipped and be cut off from everybody you have ever known. What are you going to do in California with your uncle? And what are you thinking?" The indoctrination was so bad that I convinced him that he needed to come back home and work things out. This evil son of a bitch, I convinced him to come back home to work things out. Anyway, so he did. Um, it was it was an early summer. Um, I was at home. I had um, been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I was on probably 10 to 14 different psychiatric medications at the time. Uh, Nothing could ease this pain that I was going through. Nothing could make me stop thinking about how I was going to die. I just felt like I needed to die. I felt like the whole world would be a better place if I didn't exist. Um, and nothing was easing that. Finally, my husband at the time had gotten his green card, and he was able to work and I was at home with the children. Our youngest son was probably 3 to 6 months old. So April, May, June, probably about 3 months old, and my son and my daughter were, say 4 and 5, I guess. I'm not sure. 6, 7. Um, and I was at home with the kids, and there was this little girl that my kids like to play with, and I invited her to come over and play with the kids, and they were outside running back and forth and just having a good time. And um, my we had a shed in the back where they were allowed to go and play, and um, there was the back part of the shed, there was a place where the wood had rotted through a little, and you could see a part of the daylight through the other side. And from what I understand now is the kids, thought, well, we could pretend like it's Narnia on the other side if we just busted a hole through the back of the shed. And so they did. And my husband grounded them for well, okay, this was in the spring, for like 3 months. My children were grounded. They were not allowed to play with anybody else that lived in the neighborhood. They weren't allowed to come around. They had to stay in the house, and I was there, taking care of the kids. And summer had come around. They were watching, families walk into the pool with their beach clothes, and that's what we used to do. That was normal for us. And they're like, Mom, I want to go swimming. Can we go swimming? Can I please do this? And I was like, no, I'm sorry, you're grounded. We can watch TV. We can do this. And of course, they were upset. They wanted to get out of the house. They had been stuck in the house for like 3 months other than going to meetings. And at this point, my kids had just had enough. I mean, they were upset and they were mad, and, you know, um, carrying on. My um, It was going on the evening. My husband was supposed to have been home sometime soon, and my children were all cranky and upset with me because I wouldn't let them go outside and play. And they were yelling and screaming and carrying on, and I just couldn't hardly take it. Um, I called my husband and I said, listen, I was like, you've grounded these kids for 3 months, and you expect me to, stand by your grounding and be submissive and do what you do what you want me to do as far as disciplining the children. I can't do it. Like, you need to get home. I don't know. I asked him, I was like, when are you leaving? He says, I'm leaving in about 10 minutes. And it took about 15 minutes from him to get home from the time that he left. And I said, okay. I said, well, in about 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to go in my room and lock the door. I can't take it anymore. I'm at my wit's end. I'm sure he could hear the kids screaming and carrying on in the background. My kids were upset. And I waited about 15 or 20 minutes, where he would have 5 to 10 minutes left, on his ride home. And I locked the front door. I latched the screen door, locked the front door, locked the back door, and I went into my bedroom to just take a little 5 to 10 minute time out to try to calm down before I had to start cooking dinner. And within 4 to 5 minutes, the my husband was beating on the door, and I opened up the door and he said, the kids are over by the pool. And I said, what? And he says, they're by the pool. And I said, well, what the are you doing here? And I ran towards the door, and he went towards the pool and got the kids. Apparently my two older children had had so much that they were going to get out of the house. I had no idea that they would ever even think to to get out of the house, and they did. They even took our youngest one down there. He had just gotten to the gate of the pool when my husband had gotten there, and from that day forward, I was no longer allowed to watch my own children. I felt horrible, and I felt ashamed And I felt so guilty. You know, my kids could have died, they could have drowned in the pool, and he decided that, you know, it would be best that the children were going to childcare. I insisted that my older two children, as well as, you know, the youngest, but definitely my older two children, were going to go back to the child care that they had before with my best friend, that had watched them for years before. She knew them very well. My children were very comfortable with her. They loved it there. I tried to encourage him to allow our youngest child to go there. Instead, he was wanting our youngest child to go to um, a Jehovah's Witness house. So he split our children up, and my two older children were going to where I felt like they were safe, and he was taking our son to this Spanish speaking Jehovah's Witness. And after my son had been going there for about a week, I wanted to go with him to pick him up after he got off of work one day. I wanted to see, you know, how my son was getting along there. And would you believe it that she was teaching my son, and my husband was encouraging him to call her mommy. Yeah, he was calling this babysitter mommy. And okay, and I understand that mommy is mamacita in Spanish, but his mother is English, and mommy means mom. Mommy, there's no other mommy in any child's life than their own mother. You know, you don't teach a child to call a babysitter that he doesn't even know mommy. And I explained that to him. I was like, "What are you doing?" "No, I'm mommy. Mommy's right here. Why would you teach him, and why would it be okay for our son to call this other woman that he doesn't even hardly know mommy? What are you doing?" And I explained it to him, and he apologized and that sort of thing, but still, it continued on. Um, I then, you know, started retaliating. I was like, I want to keep the kids at home. I understand what happened, and it was unfortunate, but I'll keep a better eye on them. I won't, you know, take a time out anymore. You know, like I'll keep the kids at home and take care of them and make sure, you know, that they're safe and everything. I don't want my son going over to some woman's house that he doesn't know. Why they should not be separated. If you're not going to allow uh, my son to be with you know, his brother and sister while in under child care, then they can just stay home with me. And that wasn't uh, that wasn't an option for him. Um, Eventually, I got to the point to where I felt like the best thing for my children would be for me to just, and I was so totally lost without them. I was home all alone by myself and felt completely unloved and unworthy. My children weren't even safe to be with me. Um, I hid in a shell and went into my room and stayed in my room for months and months and months. And all I thought about 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, was how I was going to kill myself. How many pills would it take? What types of pills should I take? How could I do this without my children finding my body? What could I do? Because I was afraid that I was going to get caught smoking. There had already been a couple close calls, and I wasn't, like, even still, I wasn't smoking more than 1 or 2 cigarettes a day. But I knew if I became disfellowshipped, then my children's lives would then be in danger because their parent, me, would not be able to lead them into an everlasting life. Just like in the times with the Israelites, the children of the ones that didn't listen, they were also destroyed. And so I felt as if, you know, my children were going to be destroyed because I was facing disfellowshipping. Um, I attempted suicide more than once. I'm surprised that, in all honesty, the only reason why I still believe that there's a God today is because I'm still alive after the amount of pills that I had taken and the amount of blood that I had lost when I slit my wrists. I was, I had gotten caught smoking by my daughter, and instead of, letting my husband tell the elders that I was a smoker, I decided that I would go to the helpers, go to the elders for help, thinking, okay, well, maybe they can help me, maybe they'll pray with me, maybe they can study with me. Not having been born in, I didn't really know what the policies and stuff were, but so I went to the elders of the congregation and I told them, I was like, look, I've been smoking and I'm having trouble quitting, and I feel like maybe, if you all could pray for me or study with me or something, that maybe you can help me to quit. I was told right away that if I didn't quit within 3 weeks, then I would be disfellowshipped. And so it was within 3 weeks after that I decided that I had better do it before I become disfellowshipped, because at least that way, maybe God would resurrect me at the end of the system of things if I died before Armageddon came. And so I decided that that was it. I tried. I don't know how I managed to survive the amount of pills that I took that first time. I'm talking lithium, Topamax, Valium, it's just a whole month's supply of medication all at one time. And I managed to live. And then the next time was when I really had a wake-up call. I was in the back of the van. I had blood pouring out of my arms. I had taken 1,500 pills. I hid out in the back of a park, and I was scared all of a sudden, and I thought, well, what's going to happen to my kids? How can I be sure that my kids will make it if I'm not here? And I prayed, and I prayed, and I said, I was like, God, I know they're telling me that you can't hear my prayers, that you can't hear my prayers, but if you can show me that they're wrong, if you can please just show me if I'm supposed to live, if you save my life. It was probably 4 o'clock in the morning. I was buried deep in the woods in the back of the van. I couldn't even, my vision was so distorted from having taken so much lithium that I couldn't see, but all I could see were different shades of light and darkness when I saw headlights of a vehicle at that time. And I was unable to move. I could barely raise my arm. And I raised my arm up to the glass, and I was covered in blood. And next thing I know, a man was pulling me out of the van and pulling me into his arms and telling me, "Oh, dear God, girl, what did you do to yourself?" And then I woke up 3 days later in the ICU. And now I just look back and thank God that He heard my prayer, that I'm alive today because of that, because of my suicide attempts, When I finally got enough strength to leave my abusive husband, because after I had gotten disfellowshipped, I was, what am I supposed to do? Um, when I finally got enough strength to call child services and tell them everything that was going on, and they substantiated that he was abusing my children and that they were suffering from authoritarian discipline, from isolation, forms of, different forms of abuse. He was physically abusing them. He had even shaved my daughter's head. And when I went to the elders to tell them what was going on, they quite literally shrugged their shoulders at me. And then the next talk at the Kingdom Hall was about how women should submit to their husband. Well, after I woke up in the ICU, I decided that, that I needed to figure something out. God had saved my life. Maybe I needed to fix, like, there's medication wise, something's got to, certainly there's an answer somehow, somewhere, something. I needed more help, and I felt like the only thing that maybe I could do would, there was a treatment facility nearby. They had like a 21-day program. I thought, well, maybe I can get in there. Maybe they can straighten my medication out a little bit more, and so I can get right, because I have to take care of my kids. I left my abusive husband. He'd filed for separation, and had to get things straightened out. And that's when my father, feeling like the best thing for my children to protect them would be to get custody of them, although I fought it and I kept fighting for them. Once I realized once I realized that I just needed to get better, that my children had me and me only, and that was it. I had to fix myself, whatever it took. I went to that hospital, and it was the only facility in the area that allowed electroshock therapy. And I had tried 14 different psychiatric medications to fix me. I'd been on everything. Maybe that's what I needed. Was I begged the doctor, and he looked at me and said, "No, we'll, we'll just try cutting back some of your medications, and we'll see what happens." And while I was there, I happened to meet a lot of individuals that had been struggling with addiction, and I realized that here I was trying to kill myself when these people were fighting for their lives. And I started little by little becoming more and more empowered. And so I left the treatment facility and I got out. I got a small part-time job. So I was fighting two court battles at this point, even though I had originally gotten emergency custody of my youngest son. His father fought back and in turn got emergency custody because I had attempted suicide, and requested a psychological evaluation. And while I was in that hospital, that psychological evaluation was done, and it was not pretty at all. Um, I completely understood the judge's decision. Um, I How could I fight anything? I had I was felt hopeless. I didn't have any family support. I had already pushed them all away. I didn't have any friends. Didn't have any finances. I was working a part-time job. I was eating cat food from Walmart because I didn't have enough money for food, and it just I was so far down. Um, I began working and kept thinking, well, if I've got to get my older two children back from my father. I kept fighting, and finally, eventually, I got my older two children back in 2008. And in 2008, I'd been working part time, trying to, get my shit together. Um, at that point, as far as the religion was concerned, well, I definitely knew it wasn't really the truth, because God answered my prayer when they told me that He could not even hear me, or would not even hear my prayer. So I knew that something was up with it, but the indoctrination was so bad I couldn't pick up a Bible. Even to this day, I can't even pick up a Bible and listen to a scripture in it without all that garbage coming back. And so I um, got my older two children back from my father in 2008. I, plead with the judge, that there had been substantial change in circumstances. And then, you know, since he had emergency custody, I was getting, 2-hour visitations once a week. And I was able to see my son if I called him, and was able to, see him. My son's father was always late for the visitations. He hardly showed up at all. Many times he didn't show up. He didn't really care, and I would call him, but I would call him throughout the week in the evenings, and I would cry to him about how much I missed my son and how much I wanted to see him. And he would bring my son over, and when he would bring my son over to the house, he would push himself on me, and so I felt like it was necessary. Something had to change, like desperately had to change. I wasn't in a good enough place. I felt like if I went back to court, since I had lost my son already, that I had to improve better. I was still on all kinds of medication. At that point, I still thought I was crazy, but I still felt like, I wanted to try coming off of some or all of this medication. I was scared of losing my older two children if I went against medical advice and stopped taking all the medication that I had been on, but something in my mind was kept telling me, you need to come off of this medication. And then my first ex-husband reared his ugly head, and I felt very threatened. So not only was I dealing with my father threatening to take my older two children back, I was facing my first husband had found out where I was living, and was sent his ex-wife over, and was getting lots of pictures of my children. I feared they might, I feared their safety, and he was abusive. And here my youngest son's father had my child, and he was very abusive to my kids, but I didn't know what else to do. I felt like my best option would be to leave. I got on the phone one day, and I started calling around the domestic violence shelters in the state that I live in, and found that one of them, about 5 hours away, had a program where I could possibly get involved in a 2-year program where they help victims of abuse to get an apartment and that sort of thing. I felt like at that point I couldn't prove to the judge that I was any better than I was 2 years before. And I took my older two children, and I left. I went to northern Indiana and went to a domestic violence shelter. We stayed up there for several years, and when I was first there, I felt like finally I'm in a position where we were all on camera at all the time, and I could come off of this medication that I had been on previously, and try to come off of this medication, in which I did. I'm gonna cut through a whole lot of that story, and but to tell you that when I was there, I made a determination that this cycle of abuse that we had been living in, my mother with the abuse that she lived, the abuse my father experienced when he was a child, it was passed on to me, and my brother and my sister, and the only one that was going to save me from this cycle of abuse and to save my children from this was me. I had to cut this cycle of abuse, and so I became determined to do that. Without any doctor's knowledge, anything like that, I came off of these 14 different psychiatric medications. I went through hell of a detox for years. Didn't even realize it was detox that I was suffering from. The pain that I was experiencing was absolutely excruciating. I knew in order to get my son, I had to get myself straightened out first. I was at the absolute lowest point I could possibly imagine, that anybody could possibly imagine. I was dead spiritually, at a point, and I had to fix myself. I knew in order to get my son back, and get him away from his father, I had to work on me. And the number one thing that I needed to do was to um, break that cycle of abuse. I had to come off of all of that medication. I had to detox off of that. But I was also at a very poor physical state. I, after becoming a Jehovah's Witness, I had gained well over 100 pounds. I was on all this medication that I know contributed to that, and the depression contributed to that. So I knew that I had to get myself better. I moved back down home with the help of my family, and we had started working on trying to develop a relationship, which I desperately needed. I had been alone for so many years. And when I moved back down here, I was dealing with a lot of physical problems. I had arterial sclerosis. I had been to the hospital because of a heart condition that I had. I had had to have surgery on that and have it repaired. I was so unhealthy. I couldn't walk 10 steps without being out of breath. I was way overweight. I had high cholesterol. I had been diagnosed. Of course, in hindsight, I realized that it was me detoxing off of this medication and stuff, but I had been diagnosed with 20,000 different ailments, but I was sick. I had to get better. I worked on that, and just began, walking every day as far as I possibly could. Just one step at a time, just increasing it more and more every day. I got to the point to where I was losing weight. I was feeling better. I was mentally, I was in, a much better place. I had met some people along the way that, gave me, encouragement and helped me to um, come to understand life a little bit better. And for me, really, honestly, I began really, truly loving life again. I wanted to play with my son at the park. We would go to the park and we would play tag, and I wanted to be able to chase him faster and run faster and keep up. And he was getting older to where he was about to ready to learn how to ride his bicycle, and I was at the park just huffing and puffing, trying to keep up with him. And I just made it a determination to get back to where I was before all of this began. And so I started walking every single day. 5 miles was, it got to be where 5 miles was nothing. And then I got to where I was running, and I loved to run. I loved to run when I was younger. It was a great amount of stress relief for me. Eventually I got to the point to where, just with determination, I was running up to 10 miles 3 times a week. I lost all that weight. I was finally healthy, and my cholesterol levels were normal. Um, I felt better. Then my family, my cousin, she asked me if I felt like returning back to the shop, the flower shop. It was my aunt's shop, and they needed some help for the holidays. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll try. And I did, and for a little while, and my allergies were really bad, and and I took a little break from that, and continued to exercise and continued to detox and that sort of thing. And finally, I went back to work, and I was doing everything that I could, and it got to where I was working full time. Um, Fast forward to 2013, I had lost over 100 pounds. I was able to run, you know, like I said, 10 miles 3 times a week. It was very healthy. I was eating healthy. I was eating vegetarian. My outlook on life was so much better. My youngest son, his father and I were having issues. He wasn't showing up on time. There were times where during the winter I would set out at the park where we were supposed to meet for this 2 hour visitation, and he wouldn't show up for hours. One day he didn't even show up at all, and I would call and leave him messages, and it was just ridiculous. And then finally I, went to him, and I told him, I said, look, again, this was the third time in the past 2 years where I told him, I said, look, I want to be able to sit at home and, make chocolate chip cookies and watch movies with my son. And, I've been working really hard. I'm working a full-time job. I'm, doing all these things, and Social Security has just about, my Social Security, I'm working towards, coming off of that and working full-time from now on. Could you please just, see that I'm okay and I can take care of our son? And after several pleas of me asking for this, he finally agreed to meet me at the courthouse and make an agreement that there has been such a substantial change in our circumstances, or my circumstances, that I should be allowed reasonable visitation with my son, unsupervised. And that was one of, aside from the birth of all three of my children, that was the most amazing day I've had at that point. Where my son came home, and we piled leaves up in the backyard and jumped in them, and we make cookies and that sort of thing. And finally we agreed to work on things slowly, where he'll come over for a few hours, a few days a week, and instead of doing overnights right away. And then eventually the time for overnights to start happening. See, I had my son from that was at the very beginning of November, and within 6 weeks, towards a Christmas vacation, we had finally, worked ourselves up where it would be okay for me to, we felt like my son would be comfortable enough, hanging out overnight. And in all honesty, he was comfortable from the first day. He was super excited to be with us and spend time with us. And he had his first part of his Christmas vacation with his father. And the second part of Christmas vacation was going to be spent with us. It was after Christmas, and but I believe it was the day of Christmas, or it was the day after Christmas when my son came to the house, and he brought me the most absolute precious gift I have ever received in my life. Now, this is my son that I had been concerned about for so long, about the indoctrination. I was afraid to ever speak outside of, the organization. I know how strong that mind control is. If I were to tell him, well, your dad's not teaching you the truth, if I were to talk poorly about the organization or the beliefs or anything like that, it would have been a complete detriment to our relationship. And I knew that. And so I never once said a bad thing about the organization. And so my son comes in after his dad dropped him off. He immediately opens up his backpack, and he had been making a little bit some hints the previous week, like we had our Christmas tree up, and he saw the ornaments on the Christmas tree, and I didn't want to put his name on the Christmas tree, knowing that he's a Jehovah's Witness. He's been raised as a Jehovah's Witness his whole life, and at this point, he was 9. And I didn't want him seeing that on the tree and then feeling as if, I didn't want him to feel bad. So I didn't have one on there, but he had made little hints, and he was like, well, what about, have you thought about putting an ornament on the tree with my name on it? And I told him, I was like, well, that would be completely up to you. I would absolutely love to have your name and an ornament on the tree, but I'm not going to do something that would make you feel uncomfortable. I would quiet my older 2 children. It was time for him to pray and that sort of thing. So when my son came to me and opened up his backpack and said, Mom, I have something for you. And he reaches down into the bottom of his bag, and then I don't even know how it managed to survive that whole week over at his dad's house. And when he handed me this Christmas ornament with his name and the year 2013 on one side and his little handprint that made snowmen on the other side, I can't even express to you how humbled I was, because I knew as soon as I saw it that for an entire week this Christmas ornament had been hiding in his room somewhere. And to who knows what type of persecution he would have, suffered from his father if it had been found. And he presents this Christmas tree ornament to me, and I knew at that moment that my son was most certainly going to wake up one day. He was definitely indoctrinated. He, you know, certainly was. He wanted to go to meetings and that sort of thing. He was giving talks at the Kingdom Hall already. But when I saw that, it gave me the hope that I needed to just continue doing what I'm doing, and just, continue loving him and showing him unconditional love and spending every moment that I could with him. We, played games together. He hung out with his brother and sister. The bond he created with his brother is magnificent. They are best friends. And now his older brother is a United States Marine. He believes, maybe one day he would want to get in the service himself. The bond he's created with his sister is incredible as well. She currently has 14 credit hours in college, although she's just a senior in high school. She's working towards getting her pilot's license. I'm incredibly proud of her. She's made that her number one priority. So not only is she going to high school, she's taking a college course and taking flight lessons, but she also holds a part-time job. She plays music, and they all have a knack for music. They like the guitar, and she's been teaching her little brother how to play guitar and that sort of thing. And but so the in 2016, my my oldest son left to go to the Marines, and my older two children, they had friends over at the house all the time. I mean, there was not hardly ever a time where it was just my children in the house. There were 4 or 5 of their friends were over. We would go do things. We would go kayaking. We'll go to the lake. We'll, go outside. They would play in the creek and jump off of the rope into the creek and go swimming. We would play manhunt and play tag. We would have Halloween parties and birthday parties at the house. The friends were, always over. I just absolutely love having them as in a part. They've been a big part of our lives. And my youngest son, he really started to feel lonely. The fact that he didn't have any friends was really affecting him. Especially in the late in the night, late in the evenings when he was over at the house, and my oldest son would ask, if he could go bowling or something with his friends, and I didn't feel comfortable with going in a car with a new driver, so I would, say, well, it's late, we can go to bed. And so one night he was sitting there on the couch. It was probably 1 o'clock in the morning, and he was upset because he really wanted to spend more time with his brother, especially knowing that he was going to be leaving soon. And he sat there, and he was so emotionally distraught that instead of talking to me, he had to text me how he was feeling. And he told me, he said, "Mom, I'm so alone. I don't have any friends." And I started to talk to him. This was in November, December 2016, and I, just kept encouraging him. I was like, "What do you mean you don't have any friends? You have friends at school?" And he said, "Well, no, Mom." He said, I can't have any friends, Dad. won't let me have any friends. I'm not allowed to hang out with anybody from school. And me not having been raised as a Jehovah's Witness and having been more lenient with my kids, I let them play with, the other kids from the school. I didn't see any harm in that. And so my son's pain I was listening to was new to me. Because every time I saw my son, he was so super excited and happy when I saw him. He'd come over and we would talk for an hour, 2 hours, just chit chat and just so super excited to see each other after a week had gone by. And I didn't realize how miserable he was at home. And so then I let him talk to me a little bit more, and I told him, I was like, well, you could, to talk to friends some more, you could try to get to know some people. I was like, they can't all be bad, and, I asked him, I was like, well, does your dad let you, hang out with any Jehovah's Witness kids? I mean, don't you ever go hang out with them? Because certainly I thought for sure he would have, some friendships within the organization. And my son told me no, he didn't. And at that point, I started realizing how important it was for me to work towards getting my son out of the organization, to waking him up. But it really wasn't so much me having to do that as was my son coming to me. Just a little bit at a time, I would let him open up to me. And then in January 2017, my son had started telling me, about how he feels like his father and his stepmother seem very hypocritical. The way that they talk about other people and that sort of thing. And, again, still afraid to say anything derogatory about them or the organization, but just really just wanting to listen and see where my son was coming from. He sat me down and said, Mom, he said, he says, all I can think about for the past, I don't even know how many years, is who am I going to pick? And I looked at him and said, what do you mean? He's like, well, I have a decision to make. He's like, I can either do what my dad wants me to do and make him proud of me and get baptized as a Jehovah's Witness. And, and maybe, if I become a Jehovah's Witness, I could have an everlasting life, if that's even true. And he said, so I'll give up my whole life to become a Jehovah's Witness in the hope that I might live forever, which there's no proof of. And if I become a Jehovah's Witness, Mom, I'd never be able to talk to you again. And he says, so he said, what happens if I get, what if I get disfellowshipped? After I've been in there for been in the organization for a long time, been a Jehovah's Witness for a long time, say I decide, or I mess up and do something wrong, and then I get disfellowshipped, he says, and then my dad would never even talk to me again. And then I will have not talked to you for how long? I've given up my whole life and my whole relationship with you to be a Jehovah's Witness. And he says, he's like, and so then my dad won't talk to me again, neither will his family. And he says, but at least I don't know any of them. He said, but if I were to get baptized and be a Jehovah's Witness, it means I wouldn't be able to talk to you or my brother or sister, all my aunts and uncles, because we're really a pretty tight-knit family, and at least once a month we all get together and have a big cookout, have a get-together of some sort, whether it be a birthday, holiday, some sort of thing. So he's developed a good relationship with this whole side of the family. And so he's like, and he looks at me and he says, Mom, he said, even if Jehovah does destroy me, I don't want to be a Jehovah's Witness. And as soon as he said that to me, I just looked him right in the eyes and I promised him that he had no reason to be afraid of God destroying him for having a relationship with me. And I continued to explain to him that God is love. And anything that he's being taught contradictory to God being love is not true. And no God of love would cause a division and separation in any type of family. And he looked at me and he says, Mom, I'm just a kid. How can I make this kind of a decision? And he's right. How could any child be forced to make a decision like this? And the more we began talking, he started explaining to me that his father tells him that if he chooses his mom's side, then he's choosing Satan and God will kill him. His father's telling him that if he has a relationship with me, if he chooses me, then God's going to kill him. He's been going through this for 13 years. I'm sure going through the same psychological trauma that I did, just, that indoctrination is so hard his whole life, and then debating on what do I do, what do I pick, and of course, for him it's a little bit different than what I've dealt with, but nonetheless, it is just as powerful and just as painful to, try to decide between a God that you don't know if you believe in because you have so many questions that cannot be answered, and then, or being happy. It's a choice. I can be happy or I can choose God and maybe be happy later if I get resurrected. If God finds me worthy enough to be resurrected after I've given up my whole life. My son is extremely intelligent. He's funny and witty and smart, and he is so full of life, and loves people. He loves talking to people, getting to know people. He's very friendly, and to know that his dad does not even know him. His dad doesn't know that part of him. We'll turn on the radio, music that he's not allowed to listen to, and we'll crank it up and we'll sing. I mean, and his dad doesn't even know that part of him. He dances and he's so funny and so cute. How could you not want to know your child? How could you not care to get to know your own child? My son has since told me that he feels like his dad doesn't love him, that he loves Jehovah so much that there's not enough room for him to love him. He says that he feels like he doesn't matter when he's there, that the only thing that matters is whether he becomes a Jehovah's Witness or not. I've asked him, okay, so my son was in the top 3 of the spelling bee when time had gone over and they had to proceed the next day, the next school day. As soon as I pick him up from school, he's like, guess what? And he said, well, actually, I didn't pick him up from school that day. I picked him up from his father's. He says, guess what? And I was like, what? And he's like, well, I'm top 3 in the spelling bee. And I'm like, wow. I was like, so when is the next spelling bee meet? And he says, on Monday. And I was like, did you bring your spelling words? He says, yeah, I did. And I was like, well, that's what we're doing this weekend. And, so we started studying the spelling bee words all weekend. And we were having fun with it and everything. And he said, you know what, Mom? And I said, what? And he says, Dad told me not to tell you that I was in a spelling bee. And I said, really? And he says, yeah. He said, don't tell your mom. She's just going to encourage you. Well, hell yeah, I'm going to encourage him. Heck yeah. This kid's doing really good. He's really smart. And he's about to, he can win the spelling bee. Who would not encourage their child to win the spelling bee? The amount, I can't even comprehend that. And so, to say the least, my son woke up. He realizes that he would much rather not serve a God who, uses fear to control its members. And so that day in January when he told me that he didn't want to be a Jehovah's Witness, even if God was going to destroy him, he asked me if he could live with me. And I looked at my son and I told him, yes, I will do absolutely everything in my power, and I will make sure that you can come stay and live with me. And I've been, listening to my son and the stories that he's told me throughout his entire life. He's not been allowed to ride his bike past 2 doors down his house. He's not been allowed to make friends at school, work on class projects that require time outside of school hours, which has caused the other children to have to put in more hours, and has been embarrassing and ridiculing for him. He's already embarrassed and ridiculed enough about the flag and, not saying the Pledge of Allegiance and, these sort of things. He's been terrified at this new school that everybody's going to find out that he was a Jehovah's Witness. And, me being his mom, I'm just encouraging him, hey, get to know your friends. You can invite them over. They can come over here. They can stay the night. We'll have pizza and movies and that sort of thing. But he's so shy. He's never had a friend over ever, and that he's had difficulties inviting him over. He fears being rejected and that sort of thing, but he's getting there. He's finally, got some really good friends at school that, I just keep encouraging him to talk to his friends. So anyway, when I so back in December of 2016, his father was wanting me to take my son to the meetings because I didn't refuse to take my son to the meetings at that point. It'd been since 2015. His father asked me if he wants to go to he asked me if I would take him to the meetings when he was with me. And I just looked at him and I said, well, if he wants to go to the meetings, I'll take him to the meetings. Well, my son, started coming to me and telling me, oh, my belly hurts, I don't feel like going, or, oh, I don't. And I just looked at him and I was like, you don't have to feel bad in order for me to not take you to the meeting. If you don't want to go, I'm not going to take you. I don't really want you to go anyway because I don't want to miss my time with you. And then so he started realizing that I'm not like his dad. I'm not going to make him do anything that he doesn't want to do. And so he stopped going to the meetings, and then started explaining to me that he had been getting in trouble and getting punished for things that were going on in our parenting and during my parenting time. He had gotten all of his electronics and his books and everything taken away from him. The previous, I'm talking 2015 Halloween, when we had a Halloween party at the house, we had an absolute blast. We played manhunt, we had a bonfire, and, different things like that. And he happened to be there, and when his dad came over, he noticed that we had had a party the day before. And to make a long story short, my son had all of his electronics and his phone, his tablet, everything taken away from him because there was a Halloween party at my house. And he didn't tell he said, I didn't participate, but I didn't go hide in the back room. And apparently his father expected him to go, sit in a corner somewhere the whole time we were having that party, and and had punished him because he was at the house when we had a Halloween party. Then told me that, I asked him, I was like, well, how many friends have you ever, have you spent time, how long's it been since you've hung out with anybody or had friends over or anything like that? And he says, Mom, like 5 times in my life have I ever spent time with any kids my age. And the more he talked to me, the more apparent that it became that it was important for me to get him away from there. I sent his father a text and I told him, I was like, I'm upset with you that you promised my son he would go to the meeting this week. I said, I don't wish to give up my hours, that if I don't want to take him to the meeting, I'm not going to. And there's no reason why he should be getting in trouble or being chastised by you because I, the adult, the one in charge of this parenting time, does not take our son to go to the meetings. Why would you put him in a position where he's getting in trouble because he's not going? When his father picked him up from my house after I sent him that message, I didn't hear from my son for a solid 5 days. My stomach was in knots. I was quite beside myself. Anytime I had ever spoken up against his father in any way, he had taken it out on my children. I was scared. just literally just scared. I had no idea what was going on. I was sending my son text messages and asking his father by text message and phone calls, hey, can I talk to my son? And he's ignoring me and ignoring me and ignoring me. And until I finally picked my son up. And my son had been getting ridiculed by his father and chastised every night, day and night. His father kept telling him, listen, if you choose your mom, then you're choosing Satan. If you want to live forever in a new system, then you need to pick your dad's side, because dad's side is Jehovah's side. And came down on him really hard. My son just started slowly asking him questions about the material that they were reading, and he was telling him, I don't understand this. Why would it say this when the Bible says that? And of course, his dad didn't like that very much. He was being sent to his room by his stepmom and his father. I had not, at this point, neither told his father that he didn't believe the Jehovah's Witnesses anymore. We were afraid of what would happen. We knew what would happen when that happened. Before spring break, my son told me, he said, Mom, he says, the convention is on such and such dates over the summer. And he says, I don't want to go. He's like, can you make sure that you have me during that part of the summer? And I said, well, of course. And so I set out the schedule, and I had to have it submitted by April 1st. And I submitted it to him, and I told him, what the schedule was going to be for the summer. He continued to argue with me. And of course, I put my foot down. I said, absolutely not. These are the dates that I've chosen. You've chosen for the past 3 years. What dates, you've chosen what time I can have him, when I can have him. This is when I want him over the summer. That's it. And I put my foot down, and ever since that moment, his father has looked at me as if I am Satan himself, and, been telling my son, horrible things about me. Over the summer, my son was dropped off. After my son had been here for 2 weeks, his father picked him up. And keep in mind, during this whole 2 weeks that my son was here with me, he didn't hear a single word from his father. Not a text message, not a telephone call, nothing. So his father picks him up from my house and drives him 2 miles from here and drops him off at this 88-year-old woman's to help take care of her. She's homebound. She's on an oxygen tank, and he leaves my son there in the event to call emergency services in case she needs something, because her husband had went into the hospital. While my son was there at this woman's house, he called me and he says, Mom, he said, I need you to get this phone. He said, I recorded last night. I have 45-minute recording of her and saying horrible things about how you're going to be destroyed, and if I don't listen to her, then God's going to kill me too, and that sort of thing. And at this point I had already I had been researching the organization since January, as soon as my son came to me, and I started really digging in and looking objectively to the beliefs and the practices of the Jehovah's Witnesses, which I had never looked at before. And then I come to realize how abusive the organization is, how their policies allow for pedophiles to be hidden within the organization, and for children and women who are have been abused by men in the organization to be cast out of the organization after being, persecuted by their abuser, the ones that had raped them repeatedly, forced to sit down in these judicial committees to have to decide whether or not they can whether the person was guilty or not, instead of the Jehovah's Witnesses going to the police or even suggesting to the members that they need to file a police report. The Jehovah's Witnesses will hold a judicial committee and determine on their own whether this sin has been committed and whether this person should be excommunicated or disfellowshipped from the organization. Well, they had this 2-witness rule, where if there were not 2 witnesses to a crime or to a sin, then there was no proof or no grounds for disfellowshipping. So, come on, we all know that, a child sex offender is not going to have an audience when he rapes a child. So this child tells their parent, that something's going on, that they're being sexually abused, or they go to an elder and tell them this, and instead of going to the police, they handle the issues within the organization. And I had been studying this since January. I knew that what I had already know, I had known for years that this battle with his father, as soon as I, tried to get custody, it was going to be ridiculous. So now, here my son, in July this year, after having spent 2 weeks with me, his father picked him up from my house, drove a couple miles up the road, and dropped him off at this 88-year-old Jehovah's Witness woman's house for 9 straight days. After my son had been there for 3 days, and I was asking his father um, if he needed minutes on his phone or what was going on, just indicating to him that I wanted to speak to my son, and he was not responding to me. I was calling and leaving messages on his phone, just telling him, hey, I'd like to talk to my son. Do I need to buy him a card? Without responding back to me. Finally, the next day, I called again, in which he answered the phone and explained to me that my son was visiting with this elder brother and sister from one of the congregations. I actually knew them before. When I was a Jehovah's Witness, he was um, I don't know what they call him then or now even, but he was the main elder of the congregation that I went to. And um, apparently, he told me my son was there visiting with them. So he told me that he now has minutes on his phone, and I was like, okay, thank you. And so I text my son around 7:30, and my son was like, hey, what's going on? I was like, I've been trying to get in touch with you. I was like, how long have you had minutes on your phone? He says, well, his father had called him a few hours before and gave him the numbers for the phone card so that he could have minutes on his phone. Didn't bother to respond to me or anything. My son informed me that 88-year-old woman's husband had been in the hospital, and he was there helping take care of her to make sure that if she had a panic attack or had an asthma attack or needed to call 911 for any reason, that he would be there for her to call 911. My son's 13 years old. He is over at this 88-year-old woman's house. It's a Jehovah's Witness that had previously, my son told me, she would tell him that, well, your mom is going to be destroyed come Armageddon, and so is your brother and sister. And we're going to have to clean up all their dead bodies. So here this woman is telling my son these horrible things in the past, and knowing that my son's been there for 3 days, his father didn't bother to tell me. I was really upset. And I find out from my son that his father hasn't been checking in on him. The only time that he talked to him was very briefly when his father gave him the card for his phone. Um, my son continued to talk to me for the whole rest of the time that he was there. There were 6 more days at that point where my son was there. He was texting me every day. He was there for the majority of the time by himself with this 88-year-old woman. And during which time I'm going to the police station. I'm saying, hey, my son's been left at this 88-year-old woman's house. She's previously told my son that, God's going to destroy his mom and his brother and sister, and they were going to have to clean up their dead bodies. I'm like, I'm really worried about my son. He's been left over there. His father's, just dropped him off. She can't even take care of herself. She's homebound. She was homebound 10 years ago when I was a Jehovah's Witness. Anytime she left, she would go into this asthma attack and be hospitalized. I knew she was not very well. I called Child Protective Services. I left a very lengthy report explaining to them, how my son had been treated, and explaining to them that, oh, and I failed to mention this previously. A couple months before, I had left my emergency contact information in my son's wallet. And when he came back to me the following weekend that I had him, he was pissed off, to say the least, when he told me, he says, guess what Dad put in my wallet? And he pulls out his wallet and pulls out a no blood card. A no blood card is an advanced directive for Jehovah's Witness children. It states I wish I could read it to you right now, but it says that as parents, and I want you to understand how deceiving this particular card was, because it says, as parents of Jehovah's Witnesses, we wish the very best health care for our children, but with the religious restrictions that we have, we believe that we should refrain from blood. And that's just, I'm paraphrasing. On this card, it had his father's signature, his father's cell phone number, but before that cell phone number, where it says home number, he put his wife's telephone number on there. So here my son has this wallet where my emergency contact information had been removed from it, and this blood card was put in my son's wallet, and I felt like his father was directly threatening me, or threatening our son, that how dare you put emergency contact information in his wallet. You're not going to be contacted, and if he needs a life-saving blood transfusion, my son looks at me and he says, Mom, he'll just sit there and watch me die if I need a blood transfusion. And I looked at my son and I asked him, I said, well, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? And he says, I want to burn it. Mom, I want to burn it. I don't want this in my wallet. And, and of course I assured my son in the event that anything like that happened, that I've studied the laws. I know what would happen in this state is that they would remove custody from the Jehovah's Witness parent in order to treat the child for, and get the life-saving blood transfusion. But when an emergency happens, if there's not enough time for a doctor to get that authorization through the court where they can remove custody from the child, then that child could likely die. Even if he doesn't want to, even if it's not his own beliefs, then this, so here my son is, he's terrified. He's like, if I'm ever in an accident, Mom, my dad would just sit there and watch me die. And how can I argue with that? I want to encourage my son and tell my son that his father loves him and this sort of thing. But when you do something like that, when you put something in your child's wallet, and of course my son was still afraid to tell his father that he doesn't believe in the same stuff. He doesn't believe in Jehovah. He doesn't believe that that's the truth, and he hasn't, spoken up at that point to tell him that. So my son was like, well, I want to destroy it. And so he decided, he's like, well, I'm just leaving my wallet here. He said, I'm not taking it back home because he'll put another one in there, and so I, of course, allowed him to leave that here. So while I'm, reporting this to child services and I'm telling them everything that's gone on, all the things that his father has done, the lady on the phone, she was, just astounded by everything that had happened. And, she did tell me on the phone, she's like, I completely understand your concerns. She says, I am forwarding this to the local DCS office so that they can begin an assessment and I am recommending this for an assessment. And I felt like, yes, finally, somebody's going to, listen, child services can get involved, and, at least maybe this step, will help my son by him leaving him there. I stayed in contact with my son while he was there the rest of the time with this 80-year-old Jehovah's Witness woman. When my son calls me on well, first he texted me on that Saturday morning and told me that he had gotten a 45-minute recording of this woman telling him that he was going to be destroyed, that I was going to be destroyed, and I can't remember the full text that he said, but he called me later that day and asked me to come get the phone so that I could record it. So I did. I drove over there and he snuck out and handed me his phone. We copied this recording and I got the phone back to him that evening. And this recording was awful. This woman, the way she spoke to my son was just unbelievable. Your mom ought to be ashamed of herself. She's going to cause you to get destroyed. Talking about how God was going to kill everybody that's not a Jehovah's Witness, that if he doesn't stand up to his mom and start going to meetings during my time with him, then God was going to destroy him too. It goes on for 45 minutes listening to this woman, and of course, that's more disturbing, but another very disturbing thing that she says is she's like teaching my son. She tells my son that in the new system of things, there's not going to be any bugs in this world. And I have to mention that just because of how ludicrous it is in their beliefs and practices to tell a child or try to teach a child something like that, this earth would absolutely not exist without bugs in it. And now, if you're going to tell a 13-year-old child who's extremely intelligent anyway that this world is not, that when the new system comes and in paradise, there's not going to be bugs in this world, it's just ludicrous to me. Just the idiocy in this 88-year-old woman's mind, how horrible she would say these things to my son as she continues to tell him, I know you're just a child now. So why would you say something like that to a child? Why would you talk so poorly and disparaging against his mom? Because I smoke? Because I smoke. I'm deserving of death and I'm deserving of destruction. And that because I'm smoke that God is going to kill me? That is absolutely horrible. And so I went to the police station. I explained to the officer there everything that was going on. He failed to write out a police report. He told me, he said, ma'am, he said, unfortunately, his father is well within his rights to encourage and impose his religion upon him. And I explained to him, I was like, he dropped him off at an 88-year-old woman's house, and he's like, is he eating? And I was being very honest. I'm like, yeah, he would tell me if he was hungry. And I explained, that he abandoned him there. Like he hadn't heard from him the whole time he was there. Like for 6 days went by before he even saw his father again, where he came in and briefly visited. I contacted Department of Child Services again after I got that recording, and I keep running into these same roadblocks that his father had, with freedom of religion and with his parental rights and being a custodial parent, that he is well within his rights to bring his son up in the religion of his choosing. And no matter how much I plead with them and explain to them abuse is abuse, I don't care how you abuse someone. If it's abuse, it's abuse. Psychological and emotional abuse, anytime you pit a child between parents, like making them choose between his mother and his father, that's abuse. I mean, it's very clear in the Indiana Parenting Time Guidelines. That is abuse. It specifically talks about it in those guidelines. So in essence, I'm being told from the authorities and from the Department of Child Services that, sorry, but you'll have to go to court. You'll have to, do something, as far as changing your custody. That's the only thing that would fix the matter. So I decided, well, I'm gonna go down and try to get a protective order. Something's got to happen. I need emergency custody of my son. Like right now, there's no way he should be over there at this woman's house. Imagine, this 13-year-old child being stuck in this 88-year-old Jehovah's Witness house, being told that his mother's gonna be destroyed, that his brother and sister is gonna be destroyed, and all these horrible things the whole time he's there. And it's summer. He should be out riding his bike. He should be playing with his friends. He should be hanging out here, goofing around with his mom and his sister. He should be, going to Kentucky Kingdom with us and having fun and doing what 13-year-olds do. He shouldn't be over there listening to this, as well as, listening to the convention, the 2017 Don't Give Up convention that they downloaded and put on the laptop for him to watch while he was there. Apparently that was part of what he had to do while he was there. Really? This is what they want for their children? I can't fathom where the mindset is coming from. But then I have to stop and realize how afraid I was when I was a Jehovah's Witness, that I was terrified that if I stepped outside of what the organization directed me to do, then I was going to be disfellowshipped and shunned. And to me, disfellowshipping wasn't as bad of a thing for me. I wasn't born in. My entire support system was not all Jehovah's Witnesses. Imagine how his father feels, his brothers and sisters and his mother and all of the friends that he's ever known are all Jehovah's Witnesses. And if he were to stand up to the elders or stand up to the congregation and say, hey, wait a minute, maybe this isn't right, then he's so indoctrinated, number one, that it wouldn't happen, but number two, that he would be disfellowshipped. He would have absolutely nothing. And then he would be with a wife that is a believing and him not. And I mean, just the repercussions that he would face if he ever felt like he would make a stand for my son. So my son's father is not able, because of his religious beliefs, to protect him. He can't stand up for him regarding the child abuse, even though he doesn't see it. He wouldn't be able to, even if he did. Because of his religious beliefs, he would not be able to save my son's life in case he needed a blood transfusion. Because of his religious beliefs, he is not able to encourage my son academically. My son is extremely intelligent. He wants to go to MIT. He wants to be an experimental physicist. He wants to learn computer programming. He wants to be involved in the junior honor society that he's had an opportunity to be inducted into, but his father would not allow him to do that because of the quote unquote bad association. He's not allowed to do community service outside of the Watchtower organization because he's not allowed to hang around with the other kids. My son wants to be involved in soccer. He's really good. He's had the coach of the soccer team ask him, if he could become involved in soccer, and my son had to tell him, like, my dad won't let me because I can't hang around with other kids. My son just wants to be a normal 13-year-old child, and I'm not getting any help or any assistance from anywhere in order to save and protect my child. I've gone to Department of Child Services again just recently, right before we just recently went to court. After my son was left there with that 80-year-old woman, I tried to get a protective order after I've called Department of Child Services. When I went and got to get the protective order, I was in there in the courtroom. I was sweating because I was scared to death that his father, had those papers in his hand, that he had been served. And in these papers that I spilled it all out, that his son does not want to be a Jehovah's Witness, that he's been forced to read the materials, that he's not been allowed to read anything other than the Watchtower material. His father's put him on a 6-to-1 policy where if my son reads 60 minutes of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society's publications, then he can read 10 minutes worth of his books, but only books that are approved by his father. My son likes Harry Potter and, stuff with supernatural stuff in it that he's not allowed to read when he's with his father. My son's an avid Harry Potter fan. His father doesn't know it, but he's read the entire Harry Potter series. He absolutely loves it. I feel like it's very empowering for kids, but his father sees it as witchcraft and of Satan because they have magic and all this other stuff in there. So my kid just wants to be a normal kid, and I'm doing everything in my power and being hit by roadblocks everywhere I go. Department of Child Services wouldn't step in. They couldn't help me, even though I know that they wanted to. And then I'm there in front of this judge for this emergency protective order, and the judge tells me that that his father had not been served, and he looked at me and he says. He looked at me and he says, so I've read over these papers, and he says, so he's a Jehovah's Witness? And I said, yes, Your Honor. And he says that they believe everybody that's outside of the organization is influenced by Satan, don't they? And I was like, yes, they do, Your Honor. And I said, in considering I've presented these papers in this court, I'm now considered an apostate, which means that I'm an agent of Satan. My son is being taught that apostates and are agents of Satan, and they are doing everything in their power to lead and pull out every one of God's chosen people to their very destruction. This is what they teach them. So I'm standing there before this judge, and he's read through all these papers, and he looks at me and he says, ma'am, he says, I wish I had the power to give you emergency custody of your son because of everything that I've read on these papers. He says, I feel like you have grounds for emergency custody. And he looks at me and he says, I urge you to seek a lawyer to get custody. What he doesn't know, and that I have to tell him, is since January, I have called every resource available to me. I've contacted legal aid and the Pro Bono Association. And when you're dealing with a contested case, there's just not funds for that. There's not enough lawyers out there. There's not enough time and money that they could donate in order to help with all the contested cases that need assistance. And when it comes to situations like mine, when it comes to religion, when it comes to all the, I've researched this organization nonstop, in every spare moment that I've had since January when my son came to me. I've put in no less than 900 hours of research myself. And for a law team to help represent me and to present this to the judge as it needs to be presented, and using, the laws and of evidence and the rules of court, which I have done everything in my power to help my son, and in every way, every angle that I try to fix this situation, I'm finding there's a big roadblocks. Our freedom of religion, and don't get me wrong, I feel like his father should be able to practice any religion he wishes whatsoever, but I also feel like my son, being old enough, he should also be able to choose his religion too, and that my child's rights should be heard, and they should be listened to and respected, and he shouldn't be pulled out of the meetings. 2 weekends ago, he was pulled out of the Sunday meeting as he was sitting there quietly, simply because he wasn't reading the Watchtower on his father's phone. He was pulled out of the congregation and taken outside, having been surrounded by elders on their way to the front door, and taken out there and being told, with several adults standing around, that if he doesn't pay attention during the meetings, that God is going to destroy him. My son begins having a panic attack. He's so angry at this point, and he looks at the elders and he says, "How can you threaten me like that?" And he says, "Well, it's pretty simple. It's black or white. You either do what we tell you to do, or God is going to destroy you." And my son was just completely upset. He's like, "Do you even hear yourself? Can you not hear what you're telling me? You're telling me that if I don't do what you want me to do, then God is going to strike me down and kill me." And he looks at him, he says, "You can call it a threat, you can call it anything you want to." He says, "But it is what it is." Because they truly believe that his father truly feels like he's protecting him from Satan, that he's protecting him from destruction. And everybody is a Jehovah's Witness. They feel like, and they think that they're doing good for him. They're so blind and so indoctrinated that they don't realize that this fear and this manipulation that is this tool, it's a tool that's been used to control them. And that's not how God works. That from everything that I know about my God, doesn't work that way. That might be their God, but my God doesn't. And I choose a completely different God than them, because I don't want a God that's going to threaten me, that if I don't do what he tells me to do, then he's going to destroy me. He's going to destroy my kids. That's absolutely horrendous. It caused me so much psychological and emotional trauma. I need help, guys. Like, I've done everything I can. I had to dig myself up out of a grave in order to prove to myself and to prove that I can be there to help protect my children from these kinds of monsters. I've raised 2 other children. I have a 17-year-old daughter and a 19-year-old son who I've done a pretty damn good job raising. My 19-year-old is on the other side of the world right now, serving our country, helping to protect you and me. My daughter is working towards getting her pilot's license and possibly joining the Air Force next year after she graduates. I've shown that I can raise a child. I work full time. I have made a complete and utter transformation in my life. And so I filed through the court after the judge told me, "Well, I believe you have grounds for emergency custody." So I went home and straight away, and I started, writing out the emergency custody papers. And within 2 days, I presented them to the judge in the family court. When I went to get the protective order, he informed me that it had to be done through the family court, in which the custody arrangements had already been set forth. So I had to do a modification of child custody. So I presented the judge with emergency custody, a motion for emergency custody, as well as a modification of child custody, and a motion for rule to show cause where my ex had been withholding telephone visitations as well as visitations with my son. This past April, when it was my son's birthday, his father refused to let me have him for his birthday, as well as wouldn't even let me talk to him on the phone. He wouldn't even let me speak to my child when I gave birth to him 13 years before, and he wouldn't let me talk to him on the phone because of his religious beliefs. And so when I presented this to the judge, now his father knows that he doesn't want to be a Jehovah's Witness. Um, at first, he told my son after he got the papers, he told my son, he's like, well, even though I disagree with this, and I'll respect your wishes, and we'll do an agreed modification of child custody. He told my son this, and so the next day when I called him and I asked him, would you be considering to do an agreed change in custody, he sung a completely different tune. He told me no. He said he'll do what he can, but he can't agree to the issues that I put in the papers. I made sure in the papers that I pointed out of all the beliefs and practices that are harmful to a child, that his father has been telling him if he chooses his mom, he's choosing Satan, or if he chooses his father, he's going to live forever, and all these things. And and after I had spent so many months preparing to show the judge all the beliefs and practices of Jehovah's Witnesses that are completely damaging to a child, their shunning policy, the disfellowshipping policy, the blood policy, their lack of encouraging children for higher education, all of these things that I was prepared to show the judge. I've spent months and months. I have boxes of research and papers and copies of stuff I wanted to present to the judge. And so when we went to the hearing last week, ready to, let him hear this 45-minute recording of this woman saying these horrible, disparaging things about his mother. I found out that 99.9% of my evidence was unsubmissible in court. I was not able to present any of the evidence from the Watchtower organization because I was told that he couldn't guarantee, without my son being there, that he had been exposed to the stuff that was in these papers. It was in the Watchtower organization. I was, however, able to give my testimony to the judge. The majority of the testimony that you've heard here today, I was allowed to speak for 2.5 hours. 2 hours, in which I was able to explain to the judge what effect that this religion had on me. But unfortunately, the judge, it's not unfortunate, but the judge in legal due process, has to remain impartial. So just because I felt that way about the religion, just because I feel this way about the shunning policy and the way my son has been told to choose Satan or choose forever, he cannot make the determination that my child also felt that way. He can't make the determination that my son has been psychologically and emotionally abused. He cannot even look at the material that I have collected to present to him regarding the organization because the author of these materials are not present during the court, as well as he cannot prove that my son has been exposed to each of these. I tried to explain to the judge that the petitioner himself has these beliefs, but yet 2 hours went by. The judge was anxious to proceed with the end of the day. It was going on 4:30. It was time for them to leave. He asked me if my testimony was finished, and I said yes, it was. And now here I am, without being able to present to the judge all the evidence that he needs to see, without being able to for him to hear the evidence from this 88-year-old Jehovah's Witness woman saying these horrible things about his mom. He wasn't able to hear anything like that. All he could hear is what I went through. And so I need help. I need a lawyer. I need somebody to be able to question my ex-husband. It was very difficult for me. I was standing there by my abuser knowing everything that I've ever done in the past to go against anything that he has said has always ended up with my children becoming even deeper and deeperly abused. I'm scared for my son. My son, or my ex-husband in 2013, when I told him that um, I wanted better visitation, and we went down to the courthouse. That day we were at the courthouse, and I was explaining to him how horribly isolated that I felt when he wouldn't allow me to have to watch my children. And I said I already felt like a horrible person, and then you wouldn't let me see my kids. I felt completely unworthy. And I said the reason why I was so suicidal and was so depressed was because I felt like I wasn't worth anything. And I said, and you contributed to that. And he apologized to me, but then he in his way of rationalizing, he looks at me and he says, well, I could have taken him to Mexico and you never would have seen him again, but I chose to let him get to know his mom. He said that. So him saying that means that he's thought about taking my son out of the country. And how do I not know that he wouldn't do that now if he was given the opportunity? Fortunately, I know my son well enough to know he would fight every bit of the way. But how can he be so blind? I'm at this place where I don't want to blame him. I don't want to be so angry towards him because I know he's done a lot of horrible things, but he thinks that he's doing these things in order to protect his child. But I can't forget who the monster he was when I was living there with him and the way that he treated my children. He shaved my daughter's head bald. He bust her front tooth out. He would pull my eldest son across the floor by his ear and leave bruises on their butts. And this is the man that has my son right now. And he knows I'm standing up and I'm trying to get him away from him and I'm trying to wake him up. I have no idea what's going to happen. I am really highly concerned about the safety of my son. And I really need some assistance. I've set up a GoFundMe account so that I can try to get the funds that I need in order to obtain a lawyer and some expert witnesses that can testify on the beliefs and practices of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm begging and pleading any one of you all, if you can help, if you can share this, if you can get the word out that I desperately need help. I need to protect my child. He's being psychologically and emotionally abused, and every twist and turn that I make to try to find some help, I keep facing these roadblocks. And I assure you that I will fight. When this is over, I will fight to change the legislation. I will come up with some type of a program or something. Something has to change. We cannot, as a society, as a country, allow our children to be abused under the guise of a religion. This has got to stop. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, they have been the cause of many deaths throughout the years by not allowing their children to have blood transfusions, by causing people to commit suicide because of the depression and because of the way that they feel after being shunned by everything and everyone they've ever known and feeling so isolated and left alone. I will devote my time to making people aware of the dangers within this organization. But please help me save my son.